Beer Money America. Good afternoon.
Good to see you again.
How are you doing? Hey, one thing I was just realizing the last few times, we've neglected to talk about what we were drinking, but most of the time I've been drinking water. Because one of the things that I discovered in the first few when we were drinking beer or mead or whatever, um, then it's like the rest of my afternoon, I was just like, okay, I'm done for the day.
You have
I'm
to
such a
admit,
lightweight.
a lot of time I end up drinking coffee,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is,
yeah.
the great American drink, I suppose.
Exactly. I did decide to bring one today, though, from Guadalupe here in Vista. Cool little brewery down on South Santa Fe. I don't know if you've ever seen them. They got a really nice place, and this is their Centino IPA, so it's really good.
And
So
I have
that's
to
what
admit,
I'm
I'm san beverage at the moment, so we'll see how it goes. This may be the
drinking.
most sober
Exactly right, right.
podcast we've done.
Yeah. Well, like I said, the last few weeks I just hadn't gotten around to it, but I wanted to at least make a salute to the name of the podcast because we won't spill any beans yet, but we may end up changing the name.
Yeah, well, no, I think it's probably a good announcement to make, just because if we do end up changing the names, it can be kind of a head up for
Yeah,
people to look out for the new name if we
yeah,
decide to
yeah.
go on that route.
So the name served us well for now, but we'll see where it goes.
Yeah.
Uh, More on that later. But I don't know if you have any particular topics. One thing that I thought that I don't think we've talked much about that reminded me of this when I was reading the newspaper this morning was taxes
Oh,
and
that's
kind
funny.
of where should a kind of a third party kind of fall in terms of the whole tax strategy and what's fair, what's not fair, and all that. And what intrigued me or reminded me, we hadn't really talked about it, was there's an effort going on now to kind of clamp down and doing more audits on companies and people that have private jets because
Yeah,
they've apparently have fallen off in recent years. And oops, sorry about that.
no problem.
Um, and uh, and so it was interesting because I've always private jets, although I think they're really cool, have always have been a fascinating topic for me, only because it's like I know how companies do their accounting, and it's like, okay, well, as an employee, you can't write off your commutes going
No.
back and forth to work, but in a corporation, you can write off all kinds of crazy stuff, including private jets, and so that's what kind of reminded me of it. We've never really that I remember kind of done any kind of a deep dive into the whole tax situation.
Well,
So I'd love to pick your brain on that.
I was going to say, it's funny that you brought that up, because I've been thinking about my taxes a lot lately, because the beginning of March and end of February is when I start having to get everything to the accountants and start getting
Yep.
all my tax filings organized and all that stuff.
Yep.
But I think there's a big gap in the way the parties look at the tax code, and it's just not emphasized enough. And I think it's a perfect place, actually, for a new party and a third party. And that is tax simplification. Everybody talks about they're going to tinker with the tax rates. They want these people's rates to go up, and they want these people's rates to go down, and people paying their fair share or this and that. But the thing is, huge amounts of money are spent every year on trying to sort through taxes. I mean, my tax filings at the end of the year, if you look at my tax returns, are like 100 pages long. It's crazy.
Yep. Yep.
And anyone who's involved in owning their own business or being a private contractor or just about anything of that nature, where you're not just drawing a salary,
Right.
taxes are just unbelievably complicated and difficult. And a lot of the sort of the not paying your fair share and cheating on taxes, and the seeming that the rich never seem to pay what they're actually taxed. A lot of that is based in the complexity of the code, right? Written
On
into our
purpose.
tax code is like massive loopholes for people that they can
Yep.
drive a truck through, or they can fly a plane right through, right? That's a tax loophole. And the one thing, this is just an anecdote because I always thought it was hilarious, was I think it was Ariana Huffington who was running for some office. I think it was something in California, and she produced her tax returns. And her tax returns said that she hadn't made any money over
Right.
like the past couple of years. And I don't know if people remember this specifically, but everyone was like having a good laugh at it because, Ariana Huffington is very wealthy. So how's it that she doesn't make anything? Well, and the answer is that, you have enough expenses and enough to compensate for the income coming in, and you have clever accounts. You can just write away, all of, your income. But to be able to do that requires a massive amount of assets and a massive amount of like juggling of
Right.
things, which only the
Yep.
very rich can do. So when a political party talks about, well, we need to make wealthy people pay more, so we're going to move the top tax rate from 35% to 45%. Well, I mean, that's a nice idea, but unless you're going to deal with the complexity of the tax code and actually deal with, a mechanism of taking in the receipts as opposed to just letting everyone slide through loopholes who've got clever accountants, well,
Right.
I mean, you're really not doing anything. You're just
Nope.
making it more complicated and putting more burden on middle class people who don't have sufficient assets to constantly be shuffling them around so that they never have to pay for anything. And so I think that tax simplification, as opposed to tinkering with rates, should be something that a third party should really, get in on.
Yeah, it's one of those things where they almost like to have to start all over. It's gotten to be so ridiculous, and in terms of how crazy it is, and like you said, all the loopholes and all that. So it almost doesn't matter what you raise the rates to be. There's
Mm-hmm.
always going to be somebody that figures out a way to get around it. And it seems like that we haven't learned that lesson yet. It's like this is silly. We're just messing around on the margins, and it's not going to make any major difference.
Yeah.
And so I always keep thinking about how do you do that? How do you simplify it? And my first thought was, well, because being in business, I know how these things go a little bit too, and that you have to come up with something that really deals with the top line, not the bottom line, because you can screw with the bottom line in lots of different ways, like
Yeah.
private jets, right? And but is it practical? Because then what do you include in that the top line? And then those obviously, depending on what kind of industry you're in, those are so askew compared to their actual costs and all that. So that could end up being very complicated. The only thing that ever seemed like it made sense to me was like what they do in some parts of Europe with, and it's really based on sales tax. It's like
Mhm.
those who consume more pay
Exactly.
more. And so, I mean, that's about as simple as you can get it. And, you might have some, some things that are kind of opted out of that, like food
Mhm.
or medicines or something like that. But
Yep.
everything else, hey, if you're really rich and you spend $5,000 a week on, you know, golf or whatever,
Right.
right?
Pay for it.
But if you don't have that kind of money and you're not spending it, you're not paying the tax. And that seems like it's got to be something along those lines to make it fair, because at the end of the day, we're a society of consumption,
Yeah. Yeah.
and some people consume more than others, and so that's probably about the fairest way you're going to figure out how to build a tax system.
So I first of all, I agree with you completely. Actually, my solution would be to replace the income tax with a consumption tax. Now, I don't know if you'd ever be able to have anyone buy that argument, but again, I think income taxes are very regressive, right? Because the idea is that if you're more successful and you make more income, the government starts taking more. So there's actually, when you're at the margins of the different brackets, there's a disincentive to take on more because
Right.
you're just going to get more of what you've taken on confiscated by the government. Whereas consumption taxes are, entirely controllable by the individual. It's like,
Right.
okay, I had kind of a bad year this year, receipts were down. I can reduce my consumption and also simultaneously reduce the taxes that I'm paying. And I can get by year to year. And then, when I have a really good year, I
Yep.
consume more and I pay more taxes.
Yep.
And I always thought that was really probably the the best solution. And then you could also have like luxury taxes on like any item that you buy that costs more than $10,000 is subject to an
Right.
additional, amount of tax because
Right.
it's a large item, right? And so again,
Yep.
you're then taking more money from the people who have the money to spend on those, really big items,
Yep.
whereas things like food would be tax free, right?
Right.
It's a life necessity, so you don't tax it.
Yeah.
And so I always thought that was a far better solution to anything because again, income taxes are very regressive. And the other part of it is, if you're going to do an income tax, I would say you have to have a flat tax because one of the things that I see and I think is really harmful to our politics is the ability for people who don't don't pay income tax because something like 50% of the population now takes more from benefits than they pay in taxes. And
Right.
so what you set up is a dichotomy. You have one group that entirely benefits from voting to tax the other group. And
Yeah.
eventually, people voting in their best interest is what people do. What they're going to do is tax the income generating sector of society out of existence because they have nothing to lose. It
Right.
is entirely to their advantage to tax people completely out of existence using the graduated income tax system. So I was going to say if you can't get people to buy into the consumption tax idea, at least a flat tax creates a situation where you're no longer having half of the society, trying to vote the other half of the society out of existence, which I think is a problem.
Yeah. But again, and I agree in theory with that. The only issue with it, again, is coming down to the top line versus the bottom line, right? So as you go up with income, you get the smarter accountants, more creative accountants,
Right.
and they'll figure out a way that so whatever the flat tax is whatever 10%, right? And they'll figure out a way to make it the effective tax rate much lower for them in regards to that. That's the problem with the tax system now. I
Right.
mean, there businesses, particularly big businesses, complain a lot about the corporate tax rate is so high,
Mm-hmm.
but when you do all the accounting of it, the actual effective tax rate in most cases is way under that,
Yeah.
and hence the reason why we keep going into debt and deficits because, like you say, half the people are taking more than they're paying in, and the other half are doing everything they can to scramble not to pay
Right.
anymore.
Which means
And
the
so,
entire tax burden essentially lands on the middle class.
middle class,
Um,
right?
and which again, as I say, I threw out the flat tax idea sort of as a halfway measure, and I always do that because
Right.
I have to believe that people are probably not going to be willing to give up the income tax. But as I say, I completely agree with you that I think consumption tax is definitely the way to go. I
Yeah.
mean, I would if I ruled the world, I would abolish the income tax and switch
Yep.
over entirely to a consumption tax. But again, as a halfway measure, you could then suggest a flat tax because the other thing is if you're going to do the flat tax, you can keep it simple and just say whatever any entity that takes in money has to pay 10% of the money that it took in. So like
Right.
one of the things that, we do personally, and just is just the way a lot of LLCs work. And I don't know if you're an LLC or not, but
No.
we basically disgorge all the money out of the LLC to the individuals who own it.
Yeah.
And
Right.
then the individuals pay the tax. So we don't really pay corporate taxes at all. Because as I say,
Right.
we report a zero income in the LLC, which
Right.
is accurate because we've
Yep.
disgorged all the money out of the LLC, and then the
Yep.
individuals who got that money pay the taxes. Now, if you're a huge company that has lots of divisions, you can start moving money around in all sorts of different directions, so it looks like nobody made any money anywhere. But
Right.
for very small businesses like myself, then
Yeah.
you can't really do that. Somebody somewhere along the line has to pay the taxes.
Yeah.
And as I say, if you simplify the code and just say, look, it doesn't really matter where this money lands, wherever it lands, that entity pays 10% of whatever the money
Yeah.
was. Because the other
Yeah.
thing is that a way to get away from the graduated tax code that we have is if you control enough entities and you can break up your income amongst all those entities, then all those entities have a relatively small income and therefore pay relatively little taxes because they're in
Yeah.
a lower tax bracket. And so again, there's lots of ways to be tricky about all these things. But if you just had a
Yeah.
flat tax, even if you disgorged all the money to 100 different entities, all those entities would still end up paying
Be paying
10% of what they
10%.
got, and the net amount
Yeah.
that you'd pay would be the same. So I mean,
Yeah.
you
As
could
long,
keep it simple.
yeah. As, and I agree with that. As long as you close some of the loopholes that are
Well,
out
that
there, like,
and that's what I'm saying. You
that's got to kind
basically
of go part and parcel with it,
right.
because the, you know, and hey, I'm not accusing anybody of doing anything illegal. I think the vast majority that do that are doing
Completely
totally
legal.
legal
Yeah,
things, right? To lower their rate. But it's a loophole. That's why it's called the loophole.
right. But yeah, what I'm saying is my suggestion would be, again, if you can't get rid of the income tax entirely and you want to go to the flat tax, basically you just essentially abolish the entire tax code and you start fresh with the idea of a flat tax. That,
Yeah.
whatever comes in gets taxed by this amount, done. And then of course you have to be
So you are talking about kind of the top line. Are you talking about the top line or the bottom line? Meaning that if you're company A and you bring in $1 million in revenue,
Mhm.
is that where the tax goes? Or is it when after they do all their deductions and they only end up making $10,000 out of their $1 million of revenue? That's when they get taxed.
See, that's where the
That,
devil is in the details, and it does
yeah.
make it complex. But you'd have to look at the system of deductions. Now, the thing is, you've got this huge IRS, right? That's supposed to be looking at these kind of things. Now, legitimate business deductions, are a
Right.
cost of doing business. I mean, you can't say that my business takes in, say, $1 million, and then I
Right.
pay $500,000 in salary to my employees, but I have to pay $1 million on taxes.
Right. Right.
There has to be, some way of looking at what the actual profit of the business is, and and that's, again, you'd have to determine what's a legitimate, you know,
Right.
expense, really as a cost of doing business versus, you know,
Right. And
just a
and why
bunch
I
of
get back to the consumption tax thing, because it eliminates all that. It's like, hey,
yeah.
you do whatever you want. We don't care. But when you go buy the new, computer
Mhm.
or new cars or whatever, that's where the tax comes out. And get rid of the income tax altogether.
Mhm.
And if you buy $500,000 worth of computers, you'll get taxed on that, period.
Right.
Versus me, I buy one computer and I get taxed on one computer.
Yeah. And again, I can't say this enough. I completely on board. I truly believe that consumption tax is a far, far better way to go. Because again, from a business standpoint, as someone doing business, I can look at the cost of buying new computers for my office. And
Right.
I can say, okay, with tax included, it's going to cost me this amount of money.
Right.
Well, I
Right.
can do that this year, or I can't do that this year. And I have a
Exactly.
way of determining what I can and can't do. Whereas, now, you're sort of at the mercy of both the state and the federal government and the cities and everyone else coming along and saying, oh, we're just going to suddenly put a new fee or a new tax or a new whatever. And you're like,
Right.
well, I just got screwed.
Right. Right. Well, that's this article I was reading. I'll try to remember putting the show notes. Is with they use the whole. I guess back when the last big tax law change came in, right in Trump's era, they put in the 100%. What do you call it? Depreciation
Mm,
for large items. So all these all these private jets, they can depreciate 100% like pretty much instantly,
instantly. Yeah.
right? And so it's like, okay, that there's always some way around it. So it's like, again, it's like with the consumption thing, and I don't know. I guess I have a little more positive outlook on it. I know there'd be a lot of pushback from probably business interests and stuff, but from a consumer or just normal everyday human being, um, I think most people could be convinced that this is actually better in the long run. I mean,
Yeah.
it makes things easier. To your point, you're not having to go through 100 pages just to justify why I'm paying this tax.
Yeah.
I mean, it gets real simple, a lot simpler,
Yeah.
right?
And much less of many fewer ways to get around it. Because I mean, the beauty of it is that, like, when you go to the store or you go to anywhere in
Right.
California, there's a sales tax, and it just gets included in your purchase. You don't have to
Yeah.
do anything. It's just
Right.
Done. You never have to think about it again. Now you have to consider it like, I'm going to go, like, I just bought a whole bunch of lumber to make planter boxes. And
Right.
so you calculate the amount that the lumber costs, and then there's the California lumber fee, because California has a fee on everything, and
Yeah.
the taxes. And so it ends up costing, 10% more, 15%
Right.
more than it would cost.
Yeah.
But you can consider that. You're like, okay, I see what the cost of the lumber is, and I know it's going to cost 15% more than that. And so I can still afford it. So I'm going to do it.
Yep.
Whereas, as I say, taxes, for the last few years, especially since COVID, there were so many like delays and like we're gonna forgive something and we're gonna change something and we're gonna let people off for this period of time. And it's like some of it was helpful. I'm not gonna say that
Yeah.
it wasn't, but the level of complexity that it introduced into
Oh,
everything is just nuts. It's like
ridiculous.
dates are all changed for things. There's no regularity in it. You know, the breaks are coming and going. You're trying to figure out, am I going to owe this now? Or any other things, things that get deferred. Deferring something can be really helpful, but it's like a ticking time bomb. It's like, okay, you can defer your taxes. And then, like, 6 months from now, you're like, holy, I owe that much in taxes? Well, yeah, because this other stuff was deferred and now you owe it now. It's like, oh, great.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it makes planning for things harder. You have to have substantially more cash on hand, to pay these huge amounts when they come
Totally.
due finally. I mean, there's a lot of complexity to it. And it's
Yeah.
like, you could just get rid of it.
Yeah. No, exactly. So I don't know. I guess I just think that would be just such a differentiator for a third party
Mhm.
to take that bold step, because again, I think from the masses perspective, it would just make life much easier and
Yeah.
simpler and be a lot more fair. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, just has a lot going for it. And I know people will say, well, that's not fair to businesses because, if you're building a $500 million factory and you're having to pay taxes on all this equipment that's coming in and all that kind of stuff, it's like you're not getting the long term, where you can write things off and all that kind of stuff. That I get it. Those capital expenditures can be
Yeah.
pretty crazy. But at the end of the day, you still, if you're doing things right, you're still paying the tax. So it's a matter of, how you're going to pay it.
Right.
So, I mean, that just, like you say, you build that into your cash flow statements as you're working on building that factory or whatever.
Yeah.
And it just, I don't know, it just seems like a good uh, platform policy thing that another party could really kind of drive home.
Yeah.
Because I think people are so frustrated at it, and plus also frustrated by because they're talking about all these. It's getting to be election season, obviously. So now we're hearing all these new bond initiatives coming up about fixing this and fixing that, and it's
Yeah.
like, I'm in supportive of some of it, but after a while, it's like, how many times do we have to go to creating a bond issue to fix the roads or to fix the sewer system or to
Right.
whatever the case may be, right? Or homeless. I mean, how many times have we voted on, fixing the homeless situation through different bond measures or increases in taxes? And I was not saying they're all not legit, but it's like,
Yeah.
come on now. How many
Well,
times?
a lot of the bond issues for me come down to the whole idea of the fungibility of, cash. And so what the government does is it's like, okay, we got this bond measure that says we have to spend it on, fixing potholes. So then we'll take all
Right.
the pothole money and we'll give it to, our political allies.
Right.
And so it's like it doesn't work. I mean, I
No.
think if you're 20 years old, you haven't been alive for very long, you haven't voted in very many elections, and you see these things, and it's maybe the first time you've ever seen a bond issue, and you're like, oh, wow, look, a bond issue, and it's going to go for schools. It's so great. But for people our age, and anyone who's been paying attention to politics for, say, more than 10 years,
Yeah.
I mean, at some point, you just have to catch on to the idea that you keep voting for these things. They
Right.
keep costing you more money, and they
Yep.
keep not fixing the problems they say they're going to fix.
Yeah.
And so the only way to, hold the government responsible, I think, in some senses, is to start taking away their money.
Right. Well, I
Otherwise,
mean, and California is a great example of that. It's like, I mean, in literally just a few years, we went from having actually a positive cash flow to now, I forget what the number is, but we're
It's
like
bad.
going to be 40 or $50 billion in debt.
Yep.
It's just like almost overnight. Now I know COVID created lots of issues and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, it's like, wait a minute. How do you flip around billions and billions of dollars that quickly? It's like, whoa, something's not right.
Yeah. Well, as I say,
Yeah.
it goes back to things like the whole boondoggle bullet train thing. I mean, how much money has the government of California spent on
Yeah.
the bullet train? And
Right.
where's it getting all this money from? I
Right.
mean, bond issues, because it's like if like we get more money from bond issues, then we can take the previous money from other things and spend it on trains. Well, if you're going to spend the money on trains, then I don't think you should get any more money. I'm just tired of it. There's got to be some level of responsibility. Otherwise, you're just throwing good money after bad, and it's just pointless after a while.
Well, and I think you got to really be honest about what the objective is behind it, because
Hmm.
it's really interesting. They have the new hyperspeed train that's going to be going from LA, well, just outside of LA to Vegas. And the way it's reading at this point, although it's still kind of in the honeymoon period, they're going to be spending a lot less money on that. And it's going to get done really fast.
Yeah, because it's
And
actually useful.
yeah, because people are going back and forth to Vegas all the time, right?
Yeah,
Plus, but at the end of the day, you know, I think it's just more streamlined because they know the more we can get people to Vegas and all that,
right. It has a
the
purpose.
more money is good for Vegas, man.
Yeah,
So power to Vegas, but it's just hilarious because the financial incentive is there to make it
yeah.
happen.
But it's also that there are private entities like the
Right.
casino owners in Vegas who will contribute money to it to get it
Yep.
done because they want it. They
Yep.
know the people who run the casinos in Vegas understand that like a huge percentage of their income comes from people from Los Angeles who are coming to Vegas.
Yep.
And if you can get more people coming over to Vegas because there's a train, they make more money. So it's in their interest to invest in these type of things. And
There
and
we
that's the
go.
problem with California too. It's like it builds things as a vanity project. It wants to
Right.
make some kind of political statement about something, so it decides it's going to do something. But it's building something that has no practical value, and it's not really making
Right.
anything better for anybody. In fact, sometimes it's making things worse. But it looks good because you can, go out and say, "Hey, I did this for, whatever political reason you did it for," and it's awful.
Yeah. No, it's funny. It's just mind boggling. Well, as they say, follow the money. And one last thing, I actually had another thing that popped up in my email today. I love this one because it reminded me of uh, you talking about a third party really being focused on really focused on increasing liberty and people's
Hmm.
rights and all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. And I got this in the email that Florida, the state of Florida, I love Florida. Um, they got a couple bills that are pending that would outlaw cultivated meat. And I don't know if you're, I know this sounds really real, but cultivated meat is, I don't know if you've heard of that company Beyond, not Beyond,
Oh yeah.
but they're growing meat in the lab. They're growing meat in the lab, not the fake
Yeah.
meat, but they're actually literally, and so they're trying to outlaw, Florida wants to outlaw that kind of process because it could potentially get rid of, you know, feedlots and cattle ranchers and all that kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
it just like, I just had to chuckle. It's like, okay, Florida, you're the state that supposedly believes in people's rights and get government out of my life and all this kind of stuff, and now you're telling them, no, you can't buy this stuff. Of course, it
Yeah.
hasn't passed yet, but it was just the hypocrisy of it all was just hilarious when I saw that
Yeah.
pop
I have
up.
to say, unless there's some reason to suspect that the product is toxic,
Right. Oh, sure.
I would say that it means people get to make a decision about what they want to eat.
Right. Well, and
You
if
know,
it's toxic, we already have laws to handle that.
yeah.
So,
So that's what I say.
It was,
It's a law that seemingly has no purpose.
no, well, it has a purpose, but not one that really makes any sense.
Right.
And again, it's like, come on, Florida, decide which side you're going to get on. Are you going to be on people's rights and get government out of my life,
Right.
or you gonna,
Or are you going to be all about banning things? And that's always, and frankly, that's always been, well, part of the problem with both parties, really. But
oh,
I mean,
totally. Oh,
you,
absolutely.
it's like the parties just sort of ban whatever they feel like.
Right.
I don't know, on a whim. It doesn't necessarily have any basis
No,
or any
exactly.
reasoning behind it. So it's crazy. But
Exactly.
Florida will do what Florida does. So it is what
It
it is.
will.
Yeah.
It is, Yeah, but it's funny because I mean, Florida gets lots of grief. But the one thing I will say about Florida, because having lived there for a few years, many, many years ago,
Hmm.
is a lot of the recent, and I've heard this, and I think it really is true, is actually Florida of all states has some of the most transparent open meeting laws and open documents laws in the
Yeah.
country. And so there's very little that's really kind of swept under the rug when it comes to government stuff in Florida. So I do give them a lot of credit. And as a result, that's where you get so many of these things where here it would sort of just kind of like wind through kind of quietly in the back doors and everything. And before you know it, it happened and you really didn't see it coming kind of thing. So,
Yeah. Well,
Florida gets a lot of grief for that.
I think we've talked about transparency before, and I've always, thought that that would be an area where the Republicans, could really shine.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, obviously they don't. But I mean, I think that's one of the biggest issues I think for any new party, any third party that comes along is, to really be dedicated to transparency because it doesn't really require anything except,
Right.
being transparent. But like the Freedom of Information Act, I think is one of the most important laws that exists in the United States. And honestly, I'm not even sure that it really goes far enough. But I mean, government of the people, by the people, and for the people
Yep.
means you should have a government that people have access to. And the whole idea is that, the people are paying the salary of all the government officials. The government officials are supposed to be acting for the benefit of the population. But if the government can simply classify everything and nobody ever gets to see it and things are done in closed rooms in the dark that, people just don't know about, that's not right.
Right.
You know,
Nope.
we should definitely have a right to know and see everything that's going on. And, so transparency for me is huge. I think we should
Yep.
have as much transparency as possible.
Yep. And again, I think just another one of those platforms or policies that a third party could really kind of
Yeah.
benefit and
Yeah.
push forward. And again, it's one of those things where I don't think many people would argue against it. It's like, yeah, duh,
Yeah.
right?
And as I say, it's easy to take a really strong stand on something like that because it's self obvious. It's self evident that if you're going to have a democracy, if you're going to have government of the people, then the people have to have access to what the government is doing. And as soon
Yep.
as they don't,
Right.
then it's a problem. It's
Yeah.
funny. It's actually one of my biggest problems with voting machines. And I know that's
Mm.
kind of a weird transition, but it's like if you go and you vote on a piece of paper by putting a little
Mark
stamp
on
on
it.
the paper or dot or check mark or whatever. I mean, you pretty much know what's going on. Here's a piece of paper; it has a check mark on it.
Right.
But if you go to a flat screen, like an iPad type deal, a tablet, and you push the button on the tablet or touch the screen, you actually don't know what you just did. Now, the
Right.
screen may change or may show you something, but what the software is actually recording, you have no way of knowing that.
Right.
And the software for all these things is proprietary company information. It's
Right.
not like I can go to the tablet software company and just download their software and have a nice perusal of it
Right.
because it's their proprietary software.
Right.
So it's like I don't have any evidence to suggest that, these machines are crooked or they're affecting elections or whatever. But it's just the alarm bell just goes off in my head. It's like you're telling me that I'm going to go and vote on one of these machines, but I can't look at what the software does? I mean, really?
Right. right?
Why is it, and again, talk about state and cost and, the downward effect of, states having so much debt. Well, how much money are states spending on this hardware? How much money are they paying on software updates? Why are they paying these companies enormous amounts of money to do something you can do with a piece of paper?
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think part of it is, although, before computers, people did it just fine, um, where they would count the votes. But because I mean, I think there's some financial trade-offs probably there. I agree with you on the being able to really understand what these systems are doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I hope and I assume that there are knowledgeable people within the state that are taking it behind the scenes, and apparently somebody must be doing some of that since Trump pushed that 60 times and lost in every case, right?
Mm-hmm.
To kind of get behind there. But I think it would now is probably a good time to kind of rethink that, just because people are fearful of it, whether you think it's a Trump, pardon the pun, trumped up thing or not. There, it's perception's reality, right? So if you're not really sure, and there might be some funny business going on, I mean, at a minimum, you should be able to print out, in essence, a receipt of what you voted for, right?
Yeah.
And one copy goes into another box. So if they need to do an audit, they've got an actual physical piece of paper, and you
Yeah.
could take one with you if you want. Or I mean, because in essence, that's what you're doing when you vote by mail, right?
Right.
It's a physical piece of paper, and they keep all those things until they get
Mm-hmm.
through all the audit processes. At least there's a backup,
Right.
and there are those cases where people are voting, and you just don't. There isn't really a backup.
But my only point would be that, if everything goes back to having this receipt and having this piece of paper, why not just cut out the middleman, save yourself the cost, and just have everybody write their stuff on a piece of paper like we've always done?
Well, you can do that, but at the end of the day, when you're talking about millions and millions and millions of votes having to be tabulated, because I've been back in the day when I
Yeah.
in my South Carolina days, I mean, it was still a manual system. And literally, just for like a little county that we were living in, there might be 3,000 people voting or something.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it would take all freaking night, to get elections results, and yet going through it and counting. And then they'd say, oh, wait, stop, come back, got to recount this one. It was just like, ay, ay, ay.
Yeah,
But,
as I say, there's going to be a certain amount of complexity in any system, and I
oh,
completely
totally.
agree with that. But to me, I'll always just say the most transparent, the most simple. That's definitely the way to go.
Yeah. 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 Now, I mean, there's definitely some things that need to be discussed about that, because it is, if whether you agree or not, I mean, there's been enough concern brought up that it needs to be addressed. So
Yeah, because
no
my thing is,
question.
again, it goes back to transparency.
Yep.
If we're using these machines in federal elections, then they should be subject to federal control, not private control. I mean,
Right.
it's sort of like everybody has this thing where it's over the years they've talked about like privatizing the police.
Right.
Obviously, nobody wants to privatize the police. It's not popular. It
No.
has all kinds of terrible ramifications. So why are we privatizing elections?
Oh, I know. Oh, yeah.
Doesn't make sense.
Absolutely. No, I agree. That I totally agree on. It is. It is. But there again,
Yeah.
uh, uh, it's another great platform, just the whole transparency piece for a third party.
Yeah, because I mean, the
And that's
government could have, like the FEC could, and I actually wouldn't agree with this either. But I mean, technically speaking, the government could produce its own tablets for the purposes of voting with publicly available software that anyone can look at anytime, and they could distribute laptops that were, or the tablets that were actually used in voting to any group that wanted to see them, so that they could examine the software that was on them, plug them into a printer, and see that they worked. You could do all those things.
Yep.
But as long as it's a private company that's doing it, well, if you take one of those tablets to look at it, you just stole their property,
Oh
and
yeah.
they're going to sue you.
Right.
If you
Right.
want to look at the software, you stole their property. They're going to sue you.
Yep.
So it's like Like if I file a Freedom of Information Act, a FOIA request to say I want to see what the software company is writing, they don't have to comply with that. They just
No.
say go pound sand because they're a
Right.
private company.
Right.
So again, I want to be very clear about this. I don't have evidence that suggests that our
Right. Right.
election is
Right.
contaminated. I'm not saying that. I'm
Right.
just saying that from a person who is skeptical about things and is curious, why have we as a nation largely decided to privatize our election to companies to do whatever the hell they want to do?
Yeah. Absolutely. Agree with you 100% on that one.
It's been a good
All right. We
agreement
better, yeah. All right. Well, we better move this along, and I think we've got some long-held topics that we need to address, particularly around taxes. So
well,
glad
I
we
can go
got to that
on
one.
about taxes for long and hard. But again, I'll just say for one last time before we wrap it up and before we say goodbye, consumption tax all the way. Completely agree. Totally on board.
100%. I think there should be a lot of people that be loving that idea.
Yeah.
All right, man.
Well, it's good to talk to you, and we'll see
Yep.
you soon.
Yep.
Have a good
Talk to
rest
you
of your
soon.
week.
You too. Bye.
Bye.